Hi, and welcome back to part 2 of our story here on the Franks in our Middle Ages unit. In part 1, we talked about the power of the Franks, really establishing 2 of the 3 C's. We had talked about Clovis, how he united the people through Christianity, and then we talked about Charles the Hammer Martel defeating the Muslims, the Umayyads, at the Battle of Tours and calling himself a Christian hero. The third and most famous of the 3 C's is Charlemagne, who you see in this image here. Charlemagne really becomes the most amazing king of the Middle Ages and really of the Franks as well. So let's talk about Charlemagne's story. So here we have Charlemagne on the left. There is a famous sculpture of Charlemagne just outside Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. I was lucky enough to see that a few years ago. So there's me standing in front of Notre Dame, but also standing in front of Charlemagne up there on his horse. So just wanted to include that in this. So let's talk a little bit about Charlemagne and how he became emperor. Now, Pepin the Short, who is Charlemagne's father, died in 768. Remember we talked about how Pepin the Short started the Carolingian dynasty. He was anointed king by the grace of God, which is a big deal, but it's really showing that really the Pope might have more power than the Frankish king here. But Pepin dies in 768. There are 2 sons who inherit his power, Charlemagne and Charlemagne's brother. Charlemagne's brother ends up dead. We don't know how. We don't know if Charlemagne had his brother killed so he could take sole power. We may never get the answer to that. But Charles the Great, better known as Charlemagne, takes over in 771 AD. Now, Charlemagne, you would have noticed Charlemagne. Like, he not only was he tall, 6'4", but he was the kind of guy that didn't just sit in his palace and enjoy life. Like, he was a king who got out and got work done. So let's take a look at Charlemagne as king and some of his accomplishments. So he was now the most powerful king in Western Europe. We've already established that the Franks had the most powerful empire, so it makes sense that Charlemagne would be the most powerful king. Charlemagne built an empire greater than any known since the Romans. I showed you that little map at the beginning of this video in part 1 about the expanding territory of the Franks, and it became a pretty big territory. We'll revisit that here shortly. His conquest to the south and east spread Christianity. There's no doubt that Charlemagne was a Christian emperor, or, well, he's not emperor yet, that's coming, but he's a Christian king who will promote Christianity. We're going to see that a little bit in the Dark Ages video, as well as just kind of here talking about how he at forced people to become Christian. If you were a pagan or worshipped the wrong way, you could be beheaded by Charlemagne, which doesn't sound like he's that great of a guy, but that was kind of how things operated at the time. So he united Western Europe for the first time since the Roman Empire. I mean, because he had so much territory, Rome was the only other comparable empire that we had about 300 years prior. His empire will become known as the Holy Roman Empire. Now, it is not Roman. It is not holy. He is not a pope. He is not a Christian leader. He's a Christian himself, but he is not a leader of the Christian church. But it gets the name the Holy Roman Empire. Part of the way Charlemagne got his powers, he strengthened his own power by weakening the power of the nobles. Now, nobles is an interesting historical term. Nobles typically refers to people with money, land, and or influence. People who have come from like noble births or noble families. He basically started saying to them, like, no, you don't have the influence you've always had. Instead, I am going to run the show. So he stripped power away from people who had kind of always inherited power from their parents. The other thing that Charlemagne did is he sent out royal agents to check on the powerful landowners. We talked about the feudal system. We're going to talk more about the feudal system. Landowners were out there, and he wanted to make sure that these landowners and the people were following his laws. So he had royal agents go out there and check up on his land. And I think that's actually pretty smart. We've seen other people do this. I mean, certainly people that come to mind would be like Hitler's SS, which of course was evil, but they were Hitler's bodyguards, Hitler's guys doing Hitler's work. In a lot of ways, these royal agents were like that too. Just remove the evil part of it. Charlemagne regularly visited his kingdom. He did not coop himself up in the palace. He would travel around, and think about that. You're sitting there in France, and you're a peasant, you're working out in the mud, you're working out in the fields, and all of a sudden your king shows up to your town. I mean, that would be a real big deal. Imagine how popular that would make you to be able to be seen by the people. And that was a rare thing at that time. So Charlemagne was always on the move. He was always out visiting his kingdom. Charlemagne encouraged learning. He surrounded himself with scholars and opened up new monasteries. He himself learned to read and write, which was not normal for kings of that time. Monasteries are places that people could go and serve God. Men could go and serve God. Monasteries were for men. And when you went to serve God, you needed to learn how to read the Bible. So they gave you a basic education on how to read and write. So by building more monasteries, he's actually, in effect, spreading education along with that. Now, one of the most famous parts of Charlemagne's story is in 800 A.D. He is called to Rome to help protect the Pope. The Pope is under siege from some of his enemies. He calls in Charlemagne and said, "Come on in, protect me," and Charlemagne does. And so the Pope decides to reward Charlemagne. And the story goes, there's this big coronation at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Charlemagne shows up, and some historians say Charlemagne didn't actually know what was going to happen. He walks into the basilica that day. Everybody's there. The Pope's standing at the front of the church. Charlemagne's called up to the front, and the Pope says, "Kneel." So Charlemagne kneels, and the Pope then crowns him emperor. Now, he's already king of the Franks. So by making him emperor, it's more a symbolic title than anything else. But the Pope crowned Charlemagne emperor. This historic coronation definitely draws a line in the sand. It definitely showed that the Pope had more power than the king. Because guess what? If the Pope has the power to crown you emperor, the Pope also has the power to take that away from you. Some say Charlemagne was very uneasy about this, that he didn't like that he was crowned emperor. Some historians say he loved it, and of course he felt he deserved it. So there's some differing opinions on that. But either way, Charlemagne is crowned emperor by the Pope in 800 A.D., and, that's definitely a power move on the Pope's part, because the Pope showed he had more power. Now, Charlemagne dies 14 years later. He serves as emperor of the West for 14 years, and his grandsons split up the kingdom, and that's a bad idea. The best thing you can do when you have an empire like Charlemagne is try to keep it together. And these grandsons bickered over power. They all wanted to have the empire as their grandpa did. They fought each other. And so because of that, the Carolingian kings, the Carolingian dynasty that started under Pepin, that started to lose power, and their authority started to break down. So basically their time and their efforts really led to this downfall shortly after Charlemagne. And what that's going to lead to is the rise of feudalism. So you're going to have these feudal manors out in the countryside that are going to have small pockets of power rather than one really powerful king or emperor like Charlemagne. And our next lesson in this unit is to break down feudalism and understand how it works. So we're going to look at this tomorrow in my class. But it's really a combination of the peasants, the knights, the nobles, the lords, and the king, much like we talked about with Japanese feudalism. So here's just another look at the map that I showed you earlier. You can see the growing power of the Franks. This would have been Charlemagne right here in the late 700s. He's crowned emperor in 800 AD, and he dies in 814. And then you can see his empire is split up. So we can see that here on this map. So here's the growing power of the Franks again. So that's going to bring us to the end. Our result, through Christianity, Clovis was able to unite the Franks into a strong Christian military power. Then comes along Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. He solidified Frankish and Christian strength in Europe, which helped lead to the eventual rise of the more powerful Frankish king, Charlemagne, who we just talked about. So when we come back to our constructive response question, distinguish the differences between Clovis, Charles Martel, and Charlemagne, as well as some of their accomplishments. It's pretty easy. Clovis's accomplishment is unifying the people under Christianity. By having his warriors baptized after his battle, he unifies the Franks under Christianity. Charles Martel's accomplishment is defeating the Umayyads those Muslim invaders at the Battle of Tours and hailing himself as a Christian hero. Whereas Charlemagne, we talked about many of his accomplishments. He visited his kingdom, he built monasteries, encouraged learning. The video clip, which you may or may not have seen at this point, suggests that he never lost a battle. He had the biggest empire in Europe. He's crowned emperor by the Pope. So there's lots of accomplishments by Charlemagne. So if you answer this question on the test, you're going to seriously focus on Charlemagne, because we have far more accomplishments listed for him than we do for Clovis or Charles Martel. But knowing the differences between these three guys is important to this story on the Franks. That's going to do it for us here. I hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.